Hey everyone, James Azar here with the CyberHub Engage virtual summit in the days of COVID-19. Our topic, the new cyber paradigm, how cybersecurity has essentially been transformed and changed thanks to the development of this COVID-19 virus. Joining me for this next session is Tony Cole. He's the CTO of Attivo Networks. He's also on the NASA Advisory Council. He's on the board of directors of IC². He's also an advisory board member and a member of the NACD. And his CV just goes really, so long. Very skillful guy. Tony, welcome to the virtual summit. How are you doing?
Doing good, James. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Man, it's great to have you on. I got to start off by saying, before anything else, I love your LinkedIn posts. They're probably some of my favorite to follow and kind of engage with because they're always very thought-provoking and they're not controversial, but they're very kind of in-your-face topics. So it's just one of those fun aspects. And for people who aren't connected with you on LinkedIn, they should right now.
I appreciate that.
So, as we kind of talk a little bit about the shift into new cyber paradigm, tell us a little bit, for those who don't know, what Attivo Networks is all about and its mission.
Yeah, Attivo Networks is all about cyber deception, taking the successes of deception in the physical world and applying them to the cyber realm, really to give back home field advantage to the defenders. You know, it's interesting that most defenders don't think about the fact that the attacks against them about 95% of the time, and that's a ballpark number, but a good chunk of the time, the adversaries are using deception against us, and yet we're not using deception against them to really own our own enterprise and make the adversary have to guess what's correct and true and what isn't. So it's a different shift, and it's really making some really good inroads into changing the paradigm.
When we talk a little bit about you kind of mentioned this, attackers use deception against us. And I think a lot of people are aware of phishing emails and some of the social engineering stuff that's around that. But could you share with us just a little bit about the other types of deceptions that attackers use that maybe people don't really consider deception, but really are deception in face value?
Yeah, Waterhole attacks, have risen and declined in discussions, across the last few years. And it's really interesting. That's one that's deception for sure that people don't think about. And it's simply, infecting either a website or one of the third-party advertisement servers. So websites feeding data, feeding advertisements to that site for where an organization goes, pretty frequently. So when you think about how we get breached today, whether that's a direct phishing attack or an attachment, the whole goal, including the Waterhole attacks, is for people to think an attack is a link, a URL, an attachment, a website is one thing, when in reality it's something else. So that's really the whole gist of it. So it is really making people think they're getting something when it's actually something else. And of course, right now with COVID-19 going on, that is a huge issue because there's a million scams around COVID-19 where people are utilizing phishing, Waterhole attacks, and everything else. Stimulus check calls, that just give us your account information, we'll give you a $100 coupon. So tons of attacks, all utilizing deception against us in all facets of life, whether that's, in the real world or in the online world.
It's very interesting because you're right, and yet we call these cyber criminals, some people call them hackers when they're cyber criminals that use this deception, when we should call them the deceptors, right? Kind of going off of that. But what is defensive deception technology? I mean, what does that really mean? Because a lot of people hear deception, they think so many other things. Some people think honeypots, some people think hackbacks and so forth. What is defensive cyber deception?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll tell you, back when I was in the military and I was running network security at the Pentagon, one of the things that was interesting to me was honeypots. And this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I reached out to Lance Spitzner, who'd started the HoneyNet project. And I looked at honeypots and HoneyNets and what he was building, the whole Know Your Enemy series. And I really liked the concept. Back then, The challenge really around using honeypots, which is deceptive in nature, was really designed for research, luring adversaries in that were doing attacks into a semi-unprotected box that may have some patches on it, but not up to date, that an adversary could quickly breach, and trying to very quickly ascertain how they breached that box and learn about them. But it wasn't really sitting inside anybody's perimeter. Today, that's almost 20 years ago. Today, instead, it's focused on building a deceptive component inside your environment, so completely from a defensive nature. We're not talking about hacking back. So putting breadcrumbs and lures on the production assets. As we discussed, that same deceptive attack takes place from a Decepticon, as you said, or Deceptor, right? So it comes in and they send a link so that looks real, that looks like they did a spearfish against a specific individual, spoofed an email address, and it looks like it came from a CEO. They click on that link, and that happens, as we know, every single day. Somebody clicks on that link, and the first thing the adversary does is pops up on that box and looks around. Where am I? How did I get here? Because they've sent these out, to a number of different locations. They've done their reconnaissance, and the first thing they do is they go in and they look in memory. The first thing they're going to find are some, guess what, deceptive credentials planted by the good guys, the defenders. So, and that deceptive credential or configuration file or a number of other deceptive items will lead them into a decoy environment. So any touch, and this is the important part and answers your question, any touch of any of those deceptive components inside an enterprise is an anomaly in of itself, which means you have a high fidelity alert very, very quickly from this defensive deceptive environment inside the enterprise. So we're not luring anybody in, we're just detecting those people inside the environment, doing away with all the false positives when the preventive stack has failed, and very quickly alerting and getting the team to move quickly to counter that threat that's moving inside the wire.
Yeah, it's a great explanation of the importance of deception technology for defensive purposes. But what are some of the use cases for really defensive deception technology? And there are some use cases for it, kind of on the second part of the question, which is beyond its intended use. Kind of there's so much data that you do get out of it. So how does that all come together? How does deception really help you build a more robust security program?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's very interesting. Gartner's talked about this a lot recently. NIST has now added deception, Security Control 26 to 853, Revision 5. It will be rolled into the cybersecurity framework when that's updated as well. Revision 5 will drop hopefully later this summer. It's in final draft now, and deception is not going to be pulled out, I've been assured. So that's really interesting and shows, that it's really moved a long way down that path. So the use cases for it are relatively simple, depending on the maturity of your environment and the makeup of your environment. From that, I mean, we have some customers that don't have a lot of security personnel. They don't study the adversary. They're worried instead about detecting somebody inside their environment when their preventative solutions fail, as they all do sooner or later. So they use it primarily for detection. It's a high fidelity alert. It's all hands on deck when they get an alert. It's not like the other systems that light up frequently where they're sifting through tons and tons of data looking for that needle in the haystack. Instead, when the Attivo solution alarms, they know that is a needle. It's the real deal, and you need to react to it. No solution's perfect. Of course, there's occasionally a false positive. Maybe you didn't whitelist a red team tool or something along that line. But nevertheless, it's high fidelity alerts. You can also shift that whole paradigm very forward to those lean forward organizations that have a mature capability where they want to do campaigns on campaigns on campaigns, where they want to study the adversary, and they shift them into the decoy environment, and we'll let them play for a long period of time as they study the TTPs of the adversary moving around inside the decoy environment. So really, it's from low-end detection to the high-end detection, and the use cases for that, are really, very, very comprehensive. And from that, the way the solution is delivered, whether it's on-premise, a hybrid between, on-premise and cloud, or in the cloud, it doesn't matter to us. It's delivered to the customer inside their environment. So the important piece for this, James, that's so interesting to me is the use cases quite often we're learning from our customers that said, hey, we wanted to show you this. Look what we caught. Here's the, campaign that we built, and here's what we did, with the art form on top of the science. And I like to talk about deception as art and science. We provide the science, and many of these lean forward teams build an art form on top of that with their different campaigns. We could talk about, remote location detection, protecting legacy environments, IoT, SCADA, things you can't patch. So building campaigns around that. To those companies that are really lean forward, that I have a lot of fun talking to, that go external, and they'll build social media around their campaign. So here's inside their environment, here's a decoy network they built for a new research project that doesn't really exist. And guess what? They've mapped that to social media. So somebody doing, serious reconnaissance will actually find those individuals in the real world, even though they don't exist, or information's been modified on real people to match those campaigns. That's the art form on top. So much you can do in this space, and we could talk about that for hours.
You bring up a really good point, which is a lot of cybersecurity teams kind of take deception and they take the science and they build the art on top of it.
Yeah.
When CISOs kind of look at different technologies to put in their environment, especially now in the era of remote work, and we're going to get into that and kind of the shift that's happening right now in the cyber industry, simply because of what we're going through right now. I mean, for all inducive purposes, we could be sitting in an actual conference hall having this conversation on stage with hundreds or not thousands of people watching. Instead, we're online, each in his own place, kind of in isolation. And as you look at how teams can kind of use it now in this point in period of time, how has this really helped organizations start to defend and understand the new TPPs that are happening because of COVID-19, like you were mentioning earlier?
Yeah, we have a lot of organizations that are using our AD Secure component, and a really interesting one that allows you to deploy technology onto the endpoint. So, and if that endpoint gets compromised, one of the first things an adversary will do, besides looking at memory and such, is also do queries to Active Directory. I liken it to, the GPS really of an enterprise. Provides all the information on where to go, where the applications are, who the users are, the administrative credentials. So with AD Secure running on an endpoint sitting somewhere and somebody tries to pivot back in and do queries to AD, what we do is we allow that to take place, but we provide deceptive information back to that compromised endpoint. So you're really in control, even though that endpoint's sitting in, in previous days, we would say on the road in a Starbucks or something, right? And today, obviously everybody's sitting at their house, or, some rural areas, maybe outside a library picking up Wi-Fi to work. So that's where I live. It's in some of the rural areas around here that are doing that. But it allows you to be focused on that endpoint and the security of that endpoint, even though maybe you didn't have the bandwidth that was needed, and suddenly, you've got split tunneling VPNs set up because you were, bogging down and killing everything, when suddenly you've got, 150,000, remote workers, when previously you had, 1,000, 2,000, something that you weren't designed to do. So the traffic that was going into your environment and then going back to those remote workers, so your entire architecture can't keep up. So instead you turn on split tunneling so that if they go to the web, it's not actually going back past your own IPS, your own firewalls, your own systems inside. So that prevented infrastructure is pretty much gone, and you have the endpoint infrastructure that you have to rely on. So that's one component that helps tremendously, is our AD Secure and our EDN technology, Enterprise Detection Net, Endpoint Detection Net. Guess I need more coffee. But it's interesting. It really changes things up quite a bit, because a lot of organizations, are finding they simply can't support the bandwidth to have every system go all the way into their enterprise, let alone those organizations, you feel really terrible for, that can't get all of the systems they need right now, and suddenly everybody has to work remotely. And they've all enabled a lot of organizations a lot of people to take their own personal devices and work on those. And that's even more of a problem. So you want to deploy something on there so you can watch that and protect your company still and your intellectual property.
Yeah, I think, the one thing when this whole thing happened is no one was prepared for it. Yeah. There was no time to react. It kind of hit. And I think a lot of people, I'd say 95% of people were this isn't going to be a big deal. We'll get over this. We'll be fine. And lo and behold, we start the shutdown. I remember I took one of the last flights out of Israel to come home before Israel shut down. And they were one of the first countries to really shut down in early March. And as we were flying back to, as we were on the flight back, I was talking to the flight attendant, and she was like, yeah, we don't know when we're going to be back. Like, we have no clue. We're all heading home, and we just don't know when the next flight is going to be, or if there's going to be another one, and for how long. And like you said, no one was prepared for it. We're in this era of COVID-19. We can't ignore it. And this shift isn't going away anytime soon. I've said it so many times before for those that have, listened to our podcast, or for those who follow us on social media, that until there's a vaccine and until there's an established kind of some sort of, herd, kind of like a herd, essentially, contamination where people have immunity, develop an immunity for it, our lives are going to be different, and we're looking at 18 months from now. Folks, this is not going away anytime soon. So speaking of that, we're in this era where what we're doing right now, I don't think we're all going to stay in quarantine for 18 months. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, the days of going into the office 5 days a week from, 8 to 5 are pretty much over with. Once quarantine's over with, people will start to go to work for maybe 3 to 4 hours a day for essential meetings, but predominantly to reduce infection and reduce the risk of people getting this. You'll only bring essential personnel on specific days of the week and so forth. So how do CISOs really use deception in their quest to secure their organizations over the long term of this, meaning not just right now, this very moment, but over the next 18 to 24 months, where we're still going to be dealing with this, and this is still going to be a reality for us?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And when you look at what deception does, it's very different than most of the preventative tools. And I think it's IDC said that about 100, or it might have been Gartner, I think it was Gartner, about 125 billion US dollars is spent every year on security tools. And if you look at the breaches that take place on a daily basis, there's a lot of great sites for that. Information is beautiful.net, visualizations of data records stolen. So it's one of my favorite sites to show in a visual fashion, how many breaches happen continuously. Then we definitely, have massive problems still where the adversaries, have the major advantage. So deception really, in the remote world, provides a lot of capabilities that those preventative tools, and where most of that spend does not today. So whether that's on the cloud side, where you can drop in deceptive S3 buckets, deceptive Lambda functions, deceptive configuration files, to a hybrid between on-premise and cloud. And I think we're going to see a pretty big migration to cloud, based on the scenario that you just laid out that we're living in right now. I think that that's going to be a big focus for people. How do you protect, your cloud assets? And that's a great way to do it, is utilizing deception, where you can put assets in the cloud, that are deceptive, and any touch of those, again, high fidelity alert. So you're really protecting that intellectual property wherever it resides, from the endpoint to the cloud, or anywhere in between. And I think that when you look at the issues that we have with a completely remote workforce, and quite frankly, there's going to be some interesting studies in future years, on the security issues that came up, when we suddenly moved everybody, to work from home. I think it's going to be some fascinating reading in a year or 2 years from now. You're going to see, some of the significant gaps in the preventative technologies that exist today. The deception really fills in those pieces. So that gives you the high fidelity alerts based simply on the fact that you shouldn't touch them. So let me put it this way. When you take any type of VLAN and you take the unused IP space in it and you drop decoys into that, and you align that from a campaign style, much like your own systems exist today. So maybe you've got 10% that are a little bit behind on the patching side, simply because you got to do some testing for these old applications, or you have some systems that you simply can't patch and you put additional security controls in. When you take your decoys and you align them out with a campaign the same way, those systems only get touched in one fashion. That's by an adversary. So that helps fill in tremendous gaps, where those breaches take place today via phishing, via Waterhole attacks, via fileless malware. It doesn't really matter how the adversary gets in. Sooner or later, they touch that deceptive environment. And a good 95% of the time from customers tell us that it's much, much sooner than later. So because again, as you fill up that unused IP space with those decoys, you're going to get alerts in a very quick fashion. So my point is that you're not required to run a large infrastructure for this. You can run it as virtualized cloud or on-premise if you still take that path, but it gives you a new capability for remote workers that you've not had in the past, simply because it's those high fidelity alerts that don't require a large team to monitor continuously. A large organization, we hear from some of them, yeah, you light up, maybe 3 to 5 times a month. That's it. So very, very different from all the false positives that come flowing in from the preventative side, or the Yuba solutions, looking at anomalous activity, so that are trying to gauge what's normal and what isn't. This is touch it, that's abnormal, that's a problem, you need to go look at it.
You brought up the idea of, you brought up traditional cyber, and traditional cyber is gone, right? The whole idea of being logged into a corporate network through a workstation in an office is pretty much all but gone. And this crisis has not only advanced some of the transformation that's been needed to go to the cloud, not only to transition to the cloud, but also this whole idea of what is an endpoint. Right? I mean, the definition of an endpoint has changed. My personal laptop was never a real concern for an endpoint for an organization. Now it is, because it's where I do my work from. I'm at home. And not only did our endpoints change, but who uses our endpoints has also changed, right? Kids are using their parents' computers. They're on the same network as their parents. We all know that kids are more susceptible to cyber attacks. They're easier for the deceptors. It's easier to deceive kids than it is sometimes grown adults. And I feel like a lot of us live in the shell. A lot of people I speak with in security will live in the shell where we go, well, I'd never fall it. I've got my home network segmented. My kids don't come on my home network. They have their own network. Yeah, that's true for maybe 20% of the cyber industry. And I say 20 because 20% are probably proactive on home cyber. And I think the other 80 are just, who's going to come after my kids or come after me at home? But then the rest of the population, the other 99% of people that don't work in cyber, don't have a segmented home network, don't have multiple devices. A lot of people have 1 or 2 computers at a house for 4 or 5 people. How do you start to address that specifically with deception? And how has that maybe changed the way deceptors operate in this space? Have you seen any changes in the era of COVID-19 with that?
Yeah, on the consumer side, we're not playing in that space. So not at this point in time. So it's really more focused on the enterprise side for us. So if you take that same case and you've got, a couple computers in a household, and one of them actually is part of some corporate enterprise and has to work remotely from one of their personal systems, then certainly, that's an area that we cover. And it's an area where, we could build a structure very quickly for them to deploy, our endpoint detection net on that system, that they're running, their personal system that's running inside the corporate environment. And you've got all the capabilities there. However, part of the challenge is going to be, for a long period of time, how do you help those people who aren't tech savvy? HealthNet was a great example of this. It came out just recently. They've changed a bill. I don't know if you read on this one, but it was fascinating. I did an interview on this, and they were talking about relaxing standards for telehealth because of COVID-19. So, all right, well, how do you ensure that people are doing the right things? And quite frankly, I think if you talk to many people that are sick, that are trying to talk to a doctor, their response would be, why the hell do I care? At this point in time, I want to talk to my doctor because I may have COVID-19, and I want to ensure that I'm taking care of myself and thereby taking care of my family. So when you look at that and you tear that apart a little bit and look a little bit deeper, I think about my own elderly relatives and how would I convince them? It's like, look, I'm going to tell you, you need to download this third-party app for that chat window, that you want to utilize and turn on encryption. And it's difficult to get them up on chat, let alone, get them to ensure they're running encryption on anything. So the point is that we're not going to be successful in that fashion at this point in time. I think the best thing we can do is those systems that are personal systems that are connected to enterprise, because an enterprise had to do that to be successful in getting people to work from home. That's where we can lay out deception, our EDN and other solutions onto them. But I don't think we're going to be able to solve the problem on the consumer side for some period of time, which is why you truly need deception on any of those systems connected to enterprise assets. Your scenario you laid out is perfect. I have my own family members and friends like, well, why do I need to worry about my kid's laptop? I don't do any banking on that system. They're just chatting, and now they're doing virtual school on it. Exactly as you said. Well, that's a pivot point into your own network that could get to that system that's connected to a corporate system. And that's where deception, can play a tremendous benefit, even though it's not protecting that kid doing their remote schoolwork. It still is protecting those corporate assets.
That's in this whole kind of COVID-19 stuff that's been happening. One of the key aspects, I think, for a lot of people is the fact that if you're allowing someone to log in from their home network into your corporate network, and they're not using VPN. And we know that VPN sales have skyrocketed in the era of COVID-19. But beyond just a VPN, there's so much more that goes with it, which is the device integrity. Zero trust has been really talked a lot about right now, and there's a bunch of stuff that really comes from there as well. It'll be very interesting to see how this all develops. I think now that everything, I think the dust has settled from the initial. We're a month in. I think the dust has settled. I think people are now planning more long-term and not shorter stopgaps. Obviously, I think that's one of those. You've been talking a lot about your EDN solution, kind of your endpoint net. So how's that different from a traditional endpoint security product?
Yeah, it's very different. When you look at what it really does, it gives you three different facets. So it gives you the threat strike piece, which is the credentials, those lures and breadcrumbs, and you could add decoy docs if you wanted as well. So somebody does a compromise, they take that document off the system, they open it, and it beacons back to you and lets you know that document was stolen. So a really good heads up. Our AD Secure that I discussed, that really protects that the Active Directory system, the GPS of an environment. So. And then Threat Path, which is another interesting piece I didn't touch on, and that one's great fun. I love when an organization puts that in place and they come back and talk about what they found and what they are able to fix. And what Threat Path does is it looks at the structure across your enterprise, and if you were compromised, how an adversary could move across the enterprise with orphan credentials, different shares, different paths that you probably aren't aware that are there. So it allows you to do a pre-cleanup before you're breached, so the adversary couldn't move through those paths. So that's a very interesting piece as well that's part of EDN. So some really cool facets between Threat Strike, AD Secure, and the Threat Path.
There's so many. You were talking a little bit earlier about NIST and deception being part of version 5 of NIST 853. How does deception come in, and how do CISOs utilize? I kind of want to focus a little bit more on the CISO for the remaining part of our session here for the next about 10-15 minutes or so, if that's okay with you. So how do CISOs leverage deception in the risk management plan? And how does that help them really build a better risk management profile for their organization? Let's start with that, and then I've got a few follow-ups to that.
Sure. Yeah, so when you look at deception and how it fits into risk management, and I mean, really, we talk about defending against this attack, that attack, and I mean, for any CISO, they should know this is risk management. For any company, any board, it's risk management. I mean, you are managing risk for your organization. So, and where are you going to sink your dollars? Where are you going to put those? These are high value assets. That's critical to me. The impact to my company could be huge. So I'm going to focus on those high value assets and the paths to those high value assets. And a lot of people build their whole strategy, for risk management in the cyber realm around that piece. So from disaster recovery, business continuity to ensuring those high value assets are protected and stay up. So when you look at that based on frameworks that exist today, so the cybersecurity framework from NIST 853, so feeds those controls in. If you look at the MITRE attack matrix and the fact that you're looking at it from an adversary perspective, or ISO standards or any other, all of those are frameworks to help you build a structure to protect and focus on those high value assets. We all know that you can't protect everything equally. If you try to do that, it's a losing proposition. So deception is a good fit for the CISO, now that we see NIST recommending it as a security control because they labor it out, misdirection, misinformation you're feeding to the adversary, gives you time, so gives you high value, high fidelity alerts. So, and really is, I hesitate to use this term, but I'm going to drop it in here anyway, a stopgap when the other pieces have failed. And they often fail, and we simply don't know about it. And that's the big problem that we have. When your preventative tools fail, what is telling you when an adversary is moving laterally inside your environment today? Today, most organizations don't know. And that's why we see dwell times that stretch out, according to the Ponemon Institute, up to 178 days, 56 days if you read FireEye's Mandiant's M-Trend reports. So then you get different numbers on that. But if you're not detecting those adversaries within a very short period of time, you go back to that risk management component, then the impact from that breach can be absolutely significant versus having a high fidelity alerting system that's a stopgap, that tells you when somebody has breached and moved laterally and moved past your preventative controls. Suddenly now you're able to shrink that dwell time from, pick the number, whatever organization's reporting it, but down to minutes, where you can stop that adversary. They breached, if you liken it to the physical world, somebody's broken into your house, they kicked the front door open, but guess what? You have an alarm system that, immediately went off and they went, running down the street as fast as they could before the cops get there. And it's the same thing. High fidelity alerts from deception really tie in well into a risk management framework where, the CISO gets notified when somebody's going after those high value assets, so that are laid out in the cybersecurity framework. We map to that MITRE attack matrix. We've laid out all our tools against that, as well as against the cybersecurity framework and a number of the ISO frameworks as well, and some others.
So that's great. A lot of CISOs, though, use multiple different frameworks in their cybersecurity plan, right? No one's really, I say NIST 853, as great as it is, or even NIST 171, where a lot of people say, start with that, people still use, give or take, a lot of different from all these different frameworks. How do you fit in deception in kind of a multi-framework setting in a major enterprise where, yeah, you want to spend your dollars efficiently and effectively, but you also want to be able to really withstand all the different types of attacks? And how do you explain it to the board? Like I said, you've been really good at explaining defensive deception technology as, we're not hacking back, we're giving these guys misinformation. Some people a lot of times are concerned with that. If you have a very conservative board, trying to let them know, hey, we're putting out misinformation, could even be concerning to them. How do you overcome some of those questions and some of those concerns?
Yeah, it's interesting, and we used to have a lot of trouble, when I was trying. In fact, I spent more of my time at the Pentagon trying to implement honeypots, arguing with lawyers than actually turning technology on. Because back then, and we still have that misconception today, and that's that. If you talk deception, you're talking honeypots. If you're talking honeypots, it's a research project, and you're trying to lure people in. You still have some organizations that want approvals from a general counsel because they have very stringent structure around insider threat. And with deception, you don't care if it's somebody who broke in, and is moving around inside your enterprise across the wire. Then you want to catch them. If it's an insider moving around, you also don't care, because any touch again of deceptive platform is going to cause a little high fidelity alert. Even if somebody's moving around inside your environment and you've got policies and they're very stringent policies and they're told they're not supposed to, and you have no security controls, you can end up catching those individuals. And we've got a lot of organizations that have walked people out. So you may have general counsels in some organizations that are sensitive to insider threat programs, and we have some customers that have integrated it with their HR team. So their HR team is, immediately alerted when there's an insider threat that's caught. So, and that whole process is managed through the general counsel, the incident response team, and the HR team for what's going to be the process, with their own people that are doing bad things, or maybe not even malicious, but not following policy. So I think it's something that's easily manageable today, and we've got a lot of experience on that. And we've not seen any organization say, no on deception because a general counsel doesn't want it in place. Regardless of what framework they have, we map out to the multiple frameworks they have focused on their high value assets. We have some, Fortune 50 customers that have rolled it out enterprise wide and focused on everything because they've got a lot of investment that they do in this area. They've got a mature team and they want to study the adversary. But we've also got those that have a very limited framework, and their whole framework is focused on a few high value assets that they want to do detection for and nothing more. And then a lot of customers in between out of the hundreds of customers that we have.
Yeah, it's always very interesting to see there's no one shoe fits all. There's no one size fits all in cyber, no one size fits all in any solution whatsoever. In fact, there's always a bit of a challenge for people within cyber for a lot of CISOs, which is which technologies do I really use and how do they impact, and where do I get the most buck for my dollar? As we kind of wrap up this our session together, Tony, kind of a few questions for you around the idea of what are some of the key takeaways from this COVID-19 that are really going to change the way cyber's done into the new cyber paradigm. Where do you see all of this kind of falling? Because you sit on a bunch of boards. You're obviously one of the better known names in cybersecurity. So where do you kind of see the fallout of COVID-19 in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I saw a post, and I won't mention the company name, but they were talking about all of their security folks still have to come into the office every day, and I mean, that's a concern. So you need to be able to build today a remote workforce for your security team, which means that you need to have security tools that can be accessed remotely, so they can be run remotely, that can be alerted remotely, and that team, has to have a structure for switch off. Just think about it this way. I will always remember at the Pentagon, we were early adopter of one of the first SIM solutions. It wasn't SIM, it was SIM back then, just the SIM. And it was really interesting how we told them, it's like, one of the things that's missing in this is a way to do handoff. What do you mean? Well, we want to be able to actually add notes to every event that we're working that could turn into, an incident. So, and we want to jot notes on that and be able to have it there for somebody to reference, because you could pass off information to somebody on a 30-minute overlap on shift, but guess what? Once they go, they may have additional questions, and that person's home sleeping, and you don't want to wake them to say, I missed that little bit on this, or you forgot to tell me this. So think about that today when people work remotely from home. How do you build a structure where somebody can access that remotely, get alerts remotely, but then hand that off to another organization? Don't be texting my phone, automatically on the system at 3 a.m. If we've got a team of 40 people working on this around the globe, it should be able to follow these people working in their homes. So we're going to see tremendous shifts, I think, in the technology, access to the technology, handoffs in the technology, and I think a significant shift to the cloud as well, where people aren't focused on going into work. Instead, all of the security perimeter, all of the inside alerting information, the deceptive systems are all focused on cloud and endpoint, because that's really where we've been migrating for a while now, and that's the important piece. Can we actually ensure we keep those endpoints secure, and our infrastructure, which is going to migrate to the cloud based on this much more quickly than many of us thought?
You triggered me to ask you about SOCs, and I'm going to ask you because I feel like the traditional model of a SOC, a security operations center, for those who may not know the acronym, just for those listening or watching, of people coming in and working in one building, is now going to transition to the cloud SOC, which we've seen the rise of a cloud SOC. We've seen a lot of different people talk about it, but do you see that becoming kind of the new standard in COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to see a lot more outsourcing than we saw in the past, where people go to companies, the traditional MSSPs, the traditional MSPs. And I think we'll see a lot of, cloud-focused security companies that can really help in this space. I mean, there's a lot more remote workforce than there ever was in the past, obviously. And it's going to, as you indicated early in the show, I agree with you. I think it's going to stay that way. So we're going to see a lot of people move to these cloud security companies, which I think can be a really good thing as well, because many of them are running their own security operations center in the cloud. They're providing all of the expertise for you. They're doing pretty much everything except conditioning the endpoints, and those endpoints instead connect to this cloud infrastructure. And everybody's connected to the cloud to work remotely from home anyway. Hence, we've seen some of these stocks really go up as the market's, taken a significant hit. So I think we're going to see that accelerate. And as I started to say, it's a good thing because it also allows many of these organizations to provide security expertise where maybe there were companies before that didn't have that expertise or limited expertise. Because if you go to one of those cloud providers, you can get a lot more expertise and a lot more focus where maybe you didn't have the resources to provide it for yourself. And I think we'll see new cost models come out of this as well for many of these small businesses too.
Yeah, there's going to be an inherent change in how it's done. I for one predict a bunch of consolidation over the next 12 months in the industry. And I also think that this whole idea of securing your corporate network and, the kind of layered approach of defense in depth is really going to change. Not defense in depth isn't going away, but the approach for defense in depth is really going to change going forward, simply because everyone's working through the cloud, whether you like it or not. And this is really going to change, and it's really going to impact it. Later on in one of our sessions, folks, we talk about incident response in the era of COVID-19. When you can't deploy teams to actually deal with that, how are you dealing with remote incident responses? And we'll talk a little bit about how, in fact, this has really been going on for years, and it's really good. I mean, Tony, you bring up such a great point around deception and everything that's happening, that you're absolutely right, man. I mean, we're in the midst of this change. It's going to be It's sad to see the loss of life. It's also very exciting from a technological perspective because we've never lived in a better time. This is the best time to be alive ever, in mankind. You've never had this much technology. I mean, had this happened, I think 100 years ago, at the time of the Spanish flu, the numbers would be astronomical. They'd be through the roof. And so we've been able to really contain it. Still very sad loss of life, very sad. But we'll recover and we'll come right back. We've been there before. We'll get through this again. Humanity's resilient.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a great meme that's floating around that relates to people in technology. And it's who leads, I'm trying to remember the exact thing, who leads change in your organization? CEO, CTO, COO, and the last one, and it's always
COVID-19.
COVID-19. Yeah.
Yeah, who leads your digital transformation in your organization, right? Yeah, I've seen that. I've actually referenced it a bunch of times before because digital transformation on our CISO talks, I always ask CISOs, what's the one word you take into the graveyard and bury 6 feet deep? And the one buzzword, and digital transformation has been up there about 17 times now. And so, it's funny to see kind of the need for digital transformation. There's another really funny meme, Tony, and it's a boardroom pre-COVID-19, like January of 2020. And, it's the CTO saying, hey, we really need to transition to the cloud. And, the CEO and the CFO go, no, we're doing just fine like this. We don't have the money for it. Then it's the same board meeting, everyone on Zoom going, we really need to do this now. And the CTO going, ah.
I haven't seen that one. I have to pull that one up.
I'll send it to you. I've saved it on my, I'll send it to you so you can see it. Folks, Tony Cole, he's the CTO with Attivo. Thanks so much for joining us, Tony. AttivoNetworks.com, folks, one of our supporters and sponsors for this. And Tony, if you haven't followed Tony on LinkedIn, do so now. I'm telling you, just amazing stuff that he shares on there. Great discussions, and every post gets like 100 responses. So it's always like I meet people through your posts. Like just people connect with me as we comment back and forth. It's always great.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, James. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, folks. More coming up right after this short break. So you can hit pause if you'd like and go relieve yourself, or, you know, you can just listen to an ad and support one of our sponsors in these difficult times. Thanks so much, folks. We'll be back with more right after this short break.